You all. Welcome to Grand Rounds. I'm Jesse Powell, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers this morning. We have a team of presenters this morning that we're really excited about. We have Jean McQuiggin, a board-certified chaplain who's worked here at Providence for the past 17 years. She did her master's in education and theology at the University of Portland and her clinical pastoral education work here at PPMC, and she's also worked at St. Vincent's. Dr. Jill Shaw, a gynecologic physician and surgeon at the Oregon Clinic, who's also one of the 3 executive vice presidents at the Oregon Clinic and has been on staff at PPMC since 2007. And of course, as well, our very own Tricia James, who completed her residency here at Providence, Portland in 2011. She was also the chief resident and graduated, or joined our medical education faculty after serving as a hospitalist here for several years. And I'm so pleased to welcome them all here, and they're going to introduce to you a new peer-to-peer support program at PPMC. Welcome.
All right, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Okay. So I am very excited to be here this morning. Thank you all for being here. We have been working very hard to develop this program for over 6 months now, and I am very excited to share it with you. So I have no financial disclosures. This is going to be really a team effort for Grand Rounds this morning, and I wanted to walk you through kind of the game plan. So I'm going to start with reviewing some of the current status of burnout and the consequences for our community. Dr. Shaw is going to then discuss how peer support programs can be beneficial. Jean's going to then review the peer support program as we've created it here at PPMC. And on top of that, we are incredibly lucky to have 3 very highly respected leaders in our medical staff coming to share a story from a time when they have struggled or faced a challenge and how reaching out to a peer has been helpful for them. So with that, I'm going to have Dr. Rhett Cummings come and share a story.
I'm glad the lights went down because it kind of gets us in the mood. I think most of the stories that you'll hear, you'll relate to. And the one that I'll tell, I have to read an email that I'd sent that same day that a lot of this stuff happened because of the impact that it had on me at the time, and it still does when I think about it. So it's a little bit hard to speak from the heart and de novo without actually having the email to kind of guide me through. So I'll just read the email that I sent to my partners. It's now a little more than 12 hours since the 37-year-old woman passed away in the ICU. I'm sorry to have missed the debriefing, but I'm sure that it was healing for all that were able to attend, as are all of our ICU debriefings at PPMC. Following the extended culmination of her care this morning, and after short debriefings with some of my partners, I felt it best to have quiet rest as the first part of my recovery. It now appears that I'm compelled to write this email as the next part of my healing. Since her transfer to the ICU on March 8, her critical care had been the most challenging of my recent memory. Dr. Skokin was working as the day ICU attending, and I was the night attending during that week. During our sign-out the evening of the 8th, we were both strained by the complexity and rapidity of her clinical decline and multi-organ failure. Her degree of illness was unusual for influenza, but when this severe is stunning, she lost her 16-week-old fetus that night. I'd rather not over-medicalize the description of her problems and care over the following 72 hours. However, the last 2 hours of her life were especially noteworthy. We were all preparing for a planned but risky bedside DNC for retained placenta at 7 a.m. by optimizing her hemodynamics in the face of shock and correction of her severe coagulopathy, while on CRRT and mechanical ventilation. The code blue began at 6:45 a.m. At no point over the next 2 hours at her bedside did I feel alone or unsupported. By 7 a.m., many of my critical care partners had also arrived. Soon thereafter, the mobilization for emergent veno-arterial ECMO began. The control and coordination of this level of care was an intense and beautiful thing to witness and be part of. The quick transition to an operating theater in this setting is usually only seen at very high-level shock trauma centers. Dr. O'Leary was able to cannulate and bypass was started, but the severity of her disease and acute cardiomyopathy were too much to overcome. She was pronounced at 8:25, followed by the team's acknowledgement of her life, gratitude for the efforts, and a long moment of silence at the bedside. Throughout her stay, all care team members spent countless hours with her family members, her husband, mother, father, and mother-in-law. We all became connected to them from the beginning. Her mother-in-law, a retired emergency nurse, helped us translate to the other members. There were very frequent conversations with them day and night. We all had a visceral pain of sympathy when she died, and we grieved alongside them. My personal feelings of the last 3 nights and days have fluctuated widely, including doubt, focus, anxiety, hope, frustration, fear, and sadness. I can only imagine the power of her family's feelings. I would guess everyone involved in her care experienced strong emotions too. I know I've named a few providers above, and I know there were dozens of others who were also a part, each with a unique yet integrated role. The list of her care team is long, too long to list all of the names. I wanted to acknowledge the involved services, emergency medicine, residents, obstetricians, hospitalists, intensivists, nephrology, maternal fetal medicine, midwives, vascular surgery, multiple specialty nurses, respiratory therapy, child life specialists, pharmacy, and spiritual care. My sincere thanks go out to all of you and others I may have forgotten. Our mission of 360-degree patient care is impossible without each component. I'm incredibly proud to be part of our team. I'm humbled by the hearts and souls that you pour into our work. In reflection, I am absolutely reminded by all of you, why I practice at PPMC, because of your excellence, humility, and love. I wanted to go back and just talk a little bit about the support that I received during and following this incident. It was kind of an unusual time for it to happen at 6:45. We switch over at 7 o'clock, and about that time that she was coding, 15 minutes into it, Dr. Hodgkin, Dr. Wells, Dr. Strauss, Dr. Jacobs, and Dr. Skokin and Sani were all nearby and at the bedside. So it's impossible to have that degree of clinical support in any other time. So it just kind of happened that way. So directly after, about 10 or 15 minutes after she passed away and we'd spoken to the family, Dr. Hodgkin and I, Dr. Wells and Hodgkin and I had a debriefing that lasted about 15 minutes, and we're all sort of stunned and shocked and sad and crying. And that helped. It helped a lot. Later that day, I spoke to Dr. Skokin twice on the telephone. Each time was about 20 or 30 minutes. And we were able to review the case sort of clinically and decide, how we felt we did clinically. But I think more importantly, we were able to talk about how it hurt and relate to each other how much we had emotionally invested in the case. And then even later that day, as I was driving to Hood River, I got a call from one of our peer support physicians, Dr. Lou Libby. And we were able to talk about it more. And it felt good. It felt better to be able to talk. And I think that's kind of the gist of our peer support, is just being able to talk.
Thank you so much for sharing. It's powerful. And segue into talking a little bit about the difficulty and challenges inherent to the work that we do. And in this work, I really struggle with the language. And part of that is that wellness in our culture has a connotation of weakness. And burnout, I think, has too much of a connotation that there's some personal responsibility or personal fault to what's happening. And that's clearly not the case. Burnout is clearly an organizational phenomenon. There has been a little bit more momentum around using the term of moral injury, which is defined as perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations, or a deep soul wound that pierces a person's identity, sense of morality, and relationship to society. And I think we all go into this work wanting to be part of a community that heals people and connects, and we're facing real challenges to be able to accomplish that at times, and RVU pressures and EMRs and other things are eroding that ability, in addition just to the inherent challenges of practicing medicine. So all of that being said, I am going to use the term burnout because that's what's used most widely in the literature for the rest of my time up here. And what is it? So it's really a constellation of symptoms. There are three main domains of burnout. The first is emotional exhaustion, which can manifest itself as frustration, anger, feeling overwhelmed, depersonalization, loss of enjoyment, feeling detached from the work that we do, and losing empathy. And finally, a reduced sense of personal accomplishment. This actually has nothing to do with personal accomplishment, but how you sense it, but it can manifest as apathy, feeling insufficient, or disillusionment. And what do we know about its prevalence? So the biggest study looking at this was done by the Mayo Clinic initially in 2011, and it's been repeated in 2014 and most recently 2017. And on the top line here, you can see the rate of burnout in physicians across the 3 time points. The bottom line here that you're looking at is population, aged 35 to 65 primarily, that they also sampled. So you can see that the rates of burnout have been high. They dropped a little bit between 2014 and 2017, but remain about 44% in the most recent study. And they also looked at satisfaction with work-life balance. Again, you can see the physician lines on the bottom here, lower percentage are satisfied with their work-life balance compared to the general population. And there are significant variation between specialties. This is not uniform for all medical specialties. So from the Press-Ganey data, we do have a little bit more information specific to PPMC, and in fact, the same phenomenon that we're seeing nationally is impacting us right here at PPMC. The question from the Press-Ganey data was phrased as, I rarely experience burnout from my work, which is a bit of an odd phrasing, but 44% noted that that was unfavorable and 26% feeling neutral about that question. Only 30% were able to answer that favorably. There were 2 other questions from Press-Ganey that I found interesting. One was, I'm able to free my mind from work when I'm away from it, with, again, about 60% being either unfavorable or neutral to that question. And the other question of, I rarely lose sleep over work issues. Again, about 60% either unfavorable or neutral. Our work is impacting us. When I think about burnout consequences, and particularly what exists in the literature, I think about that in 3 main categories. The first is kind of the personal consequences for an individual physician. The next is patient care consequences and what happens to the patients that we're taking care of, and finally, organizational consequences. So for personal consequences, burnout's clearly tied with lower work satisfaction, disrupted personal relationships, higher rates of substance misuse, PTSD, and higher rates of depression and suicide. And one quick comment about the rates of physician suicide are still estimated to be 300 to 400 physicians are killing themselves every year in this country. There was an interesting study that's done by Medscape every year, and just the question that was asked by that, it's sent to big database of physicians, and they were asked how they personally cope with burnout. 41% answered that they isolate themselves from others. 32% said they eat junk food. 23% drink alcohol. 19% binge eat. And then there's some at the bottom, just that call out that smoking cigarettes, using prescription drugs, and marijuana products were things that people all endorsed on this survey. What we're hoping to capitalize on is this 43% answered talk with family members and close friends. We're hoping we can increase that. So there's also significant patient care consequences, and this literature's growing. There was a large meta-analysis published in JAMA last year that examined the effects of burnout on patient care outcomes. And physician burnout doubled the odds of patient safety incidents. And burnout in physicians was found to have twofold increase in odds of exhibiting low professionalism. This was not adhering to known standards of care, not acting, I forget the word that they used, but essentially with professionalism, showing low empathy and having poor communication. And they also found a twofold increase in odds of low patient-reported satisfaction. So in addition to all of that, there are some organizational consequences, and this does not even take into account obvious patient care outcomes and what that means for an organization. This is really purely financial. And for an organization, burnout's clearly tied to reduced productivity, early retirement, high job turnover, with estimates to replace one primary care physician about $250,000 and more for a lot of specialists. And there was a really interesting study published last month in the Annals of Internal Medicine that estimated the cost to the US healthcare system at $4.6 billion per year. This did not take into account any patient care consequences. This was purely around physician turnover and early retirement and decreasing FTE. So one of my favorite quotes from this work is from an organizational psychologist, and he said, "Burnout is an organizational phenomenon that is experienced on a very personal level." And again, to reinforce, what we're experiencing is an organizational phenomenon, but I think that it affects each of us very personally. And so with that, I'm going to invite Dr. Claire Kasakian to come up and share a story with us.
Good morning. Nice to see so many familiar faces. I don't think that I can share in nearly the detail that Dr. Cummings did talking about and sharing the story about that patient. And one of the reasons is that I don't think I'll be able to make it through it. So I'm going to try to make it a little bit briefer, gloss over some of the details, but I want to tell you that before I was a nephrologist, and before I was an internist, I was a med student. And for a long time, I thought that I wanted to go into women's health, and I thought that I wanted to go into OBGYN. And I'm not really sure if this is true on a national level or it was just true at Brown where I trained, but it's tough. OBGYNs, like, that's some brutal training, and there are some really intense people that are doing training in OBGYN. And my husband and I were dating at the time, and we did the rotation together, and we were living together at the time, and we basically finished most days of our rotation being like, whoa, whoa. And at some point, he was like, hey, I know we're not that serious, but I was just wondering if you really think that you need to go into OBGYN. I said, yes, I do. He said, oh, okay. Somewhere in the course of that rotation, I think very early on, I met one of the residents. And most of the residents I found to be so overworked that there was just no time to interact with a med student. So most of the time I tried not to be in the way and tried to learn by watching, which is hard when there's so much going on and half the time you're in the OR and you're thinking you're gonna pass out. That's how I was. That was like, maybe I shouldn't do OBGYN. I did actually pass out once in the OR as a med student. Then I really knew. I get to this. So I met Juli Baker, who was kind of larger than life. She's an older resident. She didn't look older. I think she might have been, actually been in law first before she went into medicine. And she did things. She did her job. She filled her shoes and her role in a way that made it look really good. Everybody liked Juli. The nurses loved her. because she sat with the nurses and talked with them about everything. Her attendings loved her because she was super smart, extremely reliable. Her patients loved her because she was confident and kind. She spent time with people. She looked them in the eye. She was savvy and charismatic. She was one of those people you're like, I like this girl. I don't know anything, but I'm just gonna walk behind her. And she was really kind to me, and she was kind to my now husband. And I didn't spend a ton of time with her, but I watched her, and we had some mutual friends. So as I continued doing my training at Brown, going on to do internal medicine there for residency, we went on to have some connections, some people. And so I would hear about her, and I would see her, and I met her partner at some point, and so fast forward to 2011. It was H1N1 season, maybe the theme of the stories of the day. And I was the admitting second-year resident in the ICU. And it was a really busy night. And I got called down to evaluate a patient. And she was hypoxic and tachypnic and 39. And it was 2 o'clock in the morning. And right before I walked in the room, I kind of, it's like, huh. And I came in, and it was Juli and her partner. And she got admitted to the ICU. She had a bunch of viral symptoms, but mostly she was hypoxic. She went on high flow oxygen. In the morning, she was intubated. Brown wasn't an ECMO center yet, but we were right next to the children's hospital that was. And the pediatric ECMO team came over to our ICU and took care of Juli. The pediatric attendings took care of her 24 hours a day. Their phone numbers, their personal cell phones were on the wall. And all of the nurses who were there were a combination of the adult ICU nurses that we knew so well and trusted and loved, and new faces. But we were working with attendings who didn't do ECMO. We weren't an ECMO center. And throughout her hospitalization, I had that same sensation of, this doesn't quite feel like the same story as everyone else. She's not just a patient. She's not just someone I know. She wasn't just a little sick. She was so sick that when she came in, I had to cut her scrub top off to put her Johnny on because she couldn't do it. She was too dyspneic. And I remember telling her, like, it's okay. We'll just cut this off. It's all right. I don't need this. And when she was intubated, it didn't feel right. It seemed like she was stressed. Maybe she didn't get enough sedation. I didn't intubate her. I'm not blaming anyone. But I could see that our whole team was stressed. One of her co-residents, because the OBGYN residents rounded with us in the ICU on a regular basis, one of her co-residents, who had been one of her interns, was on the team, and she left because it was too horrible. And there were just these moments where I think as trainees, it was just like, it was a lot. It was a lot. And I was the primary resident who followed her. And I remember my co-resident, Nick Chiquez, such a solid guy, now an intensivist on the East Coast. So lovely, so smart, so supportive, not really like emotional, but he just was like solid for me throughout that month. And he would be like, how you doing? I'm good. He's like, okay. Need any help? I'm like, nope. I'm like, okay. So she went on ECMO, and we all just wanted her to get better, and she didn't get better. She developed pseudomonal bacteremia, and she died. And I had the family meeting with her parents and her partner and her friends. And at some point in this, my good friend Rachel, who's still here, just talked to me throughout it. And I think one of the things is that I realize that some of these stories affect us for years and maybe our whole life, and that it's our community around us that just checks in. Sometimes I'll just send Rachel a message and I just say, I was thinking about Juli. And so I think we can all be that for each other, because that makes it okay, because sometimes these things are so personal. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, Claire. That's a really powerful story, and it reminds me of something that happened to me in medical school as well that I'd forgotten about until this morning. The title of our talk today, What's in Your Backpack? And I literally brought a backpack today just to remind us, like Claire, like Rhett, we've all had things happen. We're all carrying things around with us that affect us differently. And in medicine, we're trained to be professional fixers, perfectionists. There's no room for error. How do we make it safe for ourselves? And how do we give what we don't have as caregivers? There are multiple articles out there that show that what helps providers after an adverse event or a medical error is talking, especially to colleagues. This is independent from a root cause analysis, a morbidity and mortality event. It's the empathetic gift of your undivided attention is probably the greatest gift you can give for another provider who's suffering, dealing from a bad day at work. So I wanted to include the sciencey references for the inquiring minds that want to see the proof. Here's just some of the proof. If you do a journal article search for names Shanafelt, Derby, West, you will find multiple studies that validate talking helps, among other things. There are some large organizational interventions that have also been shown to improve provider burnout levels, and there are multiple scientific articles that show that increased levels of burnout directly impact patient care and team functioning. If we had unlimited resources, we could potentially do some things like what Mayo and Stanford have done. These are some examples of some formal mentoring programs. Stanford did a program where they spent about $150,000 on 45 physicians over a 9-month period with structured 2-hour monthly group meetings and one-on-one coaching, and improved collegiality and reduced burnout. Johns Hopkins has an organizational-wide program called Resilience in Stressful Events that they've operationalized, and the Maryland Safety Patient Commission has helped roll that out. It's an extensive program that they bring to organizations. Virginia Tech and the Carilion Clinic has a fabulous peer support program and an overall culture of wellness, and I would strongly encourage you to look at any of these websites to see what is out there. But as we think about our day-to-day and how we're getting through, do we have time for, is organizational buy-in for this essential? Absolutely. Do we have time to wait to see what organizational programs come through or what grant money we have to kind of do this collegiality building work? I don't think so. We've got the data from our Press-Ganey survey to show that we've got some pretty high levels of burnout. So how do we move forward? I put this quote here just to remind us that we really can't give what we don't have. And the inspiration for our initiative at the Oregon Clinic was that 70% of our providers are Providence affiliated, and at the time, Providence didn't yet have a formal peer support program, but we're going to now. The Shanafelt Noseworthy article has come to the attention of the enterprise leadership and has been talked about at the Allison Inn Leadership Retreats in the last 2 years. It lays out some excellent framework for organizational interventions. The foundational article that inspired me was the one by Dr. Shapiro that basically spells out the nuts and bolts of here are the components of a peer support program, literally here's how you make the calls. So what we did at the Oregon Clinic is we didn't want to burn out our providers on burnout surveys, so we used single item validated questions, and these are the references that validate those against the Maslach burnout inventory. And we sent a survey monkey to our 200 physicians and said, the purpose of the survey was twofold. First, to assess our baseline levels of burnout and depersonalization, and secondly, to get a list of trusted and respected peers. Like, who would you turn to if you had a really bad day at work or an ICU patient that died unexpectedly? Who would you turn to for support? And the responses we got, I will tell you, first off, we didn't get a fabulous response rate, but it was just under 30%. What we did get was a wonderful list of trusted and respected peers. So we wrote to those trusted and respected peers and congratulated them and invited them to join us for a one-time formal training by Dr. Joe Shapiro in the skill set of peer support. This is the emotional first aid we do professionally on a daily basis, but without the fixing component. And we were able to, over a 6-month period, set up 2 trainings for 37 providers. The month after our initial training, we started our peer support program, and we communicated it with emails, with direct messaging at our board meetings and provider group meetings, word of mouth, obviously, and made sure that people knew how to refer to us: email, text, phone call, dedicated number. And what we found was that within the first 6 months of our program, we were averaging 4 peer support calls a month, which matches Dr. Shapiro's Brigham and Women's, like the East Coast Harvard Teaching Hospital utilization, and their staff is 10 times the size of our 200 physician Oregon Clinic group. We had a 51.8% acceptance rate in those outreach calls. So not everybody that we talked to said, yeah, I'll take that call. But for the ones who did, when we resurveyed a year from our original assessment, we repeated those burnout questions, and we asked a few other questions. And what we found was that of the people who got a call, 14 of them wanted that call, and that matches our acceptance rate. We found that over 89% of our providers were aware of how to access the program. We also asked for validation of our framework moving forward, because for the Oregon Clinic, this was kind of our baby step into provider wellness, just peer support and then what. And they validated the framework that has been spelled out by the Stanford Well MD model, so the concept of culture of wellness, efficiency of practice, and personal resilience. What we found was our baseline depersonalization rate was 38.6%. 9 months after implementation, or a year after our original survey, that had dropped to 15.8% for a 22.8% reduction. And our baseline burnout rate was 50.9%, and that dropped to 28.4%, which is a 22.5% reduction. And that was with a doubling of our response rate. So we had over 49% of our physicians respond in this. I can't infer causation, but I can say what's different in a year. We've made it safe for providers to talk to providers. And the most exciting thing about what's happening is the literature shows that when you build programs like this and just wait for people to call, people don't call. You have to extend the invitation. And that's what we started with at the Oregon Clinic. And what that has evolved to is we actually have providers themselves seeking a peer support outreach call, which just makes me even more excited for how can we continue to change the culture. So that's just a little bit of an overview of what's happened at the Oregon Clinic, and we're excited to bring this here to Providence, Portland. And now Jean McQuiggin is going to tell you about what happens next.
Thank you. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. So as I was introduced, I'm Jean McQuiggin. I've been with Providence for several years and have served in critical care. I would like to also introduce Chaplain Juli Dreyer, who works in labor and delivery, NICU, and fifth floor diabetes, and Carl Jensen, chaplain at the cancer unit. Together, we are the local coordinators for the peer-to-peer program. What is our role, our job description? It is to oversee the flow of referrals and management of the peer support program. We collaborate with a physician triage partner, Dr. Tricia James, to ensure suitable referrals. We work closely with our compassion program manager, Krista Nelson, who is the oncology social worker, to gather institutional support, participation in trainings, and discuss difficult interactions. As needed, our team will consult with the peer-to-peer advisory council to identify relevant themes and trends requiring an organizational response. I want to insert here that this peer-to-peer program is a pilot project beginning with doctors. The plan is eventually to open the peer-to-peer opportunity for all disciplines, all caregivers here at PPMC. What are the triggers for making a referral to the peer-to-peer program? This list is not exclusive, but may include an adverse event, a conflict with a patient or staff, death in a family, death of a significant patient with whom you've bonded, death of a coworker, an unusual occurrence or lawsuit, a notice of a change in your colleagues, which you note, a quality management referral, or participation in a traumatic code gray situation. So who can make a referral? First, MDs, who are concerned about how another colleague is coping after a stressful incident. Working together so closely, you may notice when your colleague is struggling and not reaching out for support. Many of us who aren't physicians may not intuit their distress. Self-referral. As it's been mentioned earlier, our I can handle this myself culture doesn't promote vulnerability or admitting I could use some help here, which we all do from time to time. Self-referral may be one of the biggest gifts you can give to yourself. Good self-care, as we all know, not only benefits ourselves, but benefits our colleagues and family members. Chaplains, house supervisors, anyone noticing that a doctor may be suffering and struggling after a critical incident may make a referral. Excuse me. So what is the process for making a referral? The process is simple and confidential. You'll notice that the confidential email address that you see on the screen has been set up, which can be accessed only by Chaplain Juli, Chaplain Carl, and myself. You would state your name, which is confidential, and your concern about your colleague. We will check this email box often. There are more than 40 physicians who have been nominated by their peers and have accepted the role at this time to be peer supporters. They will attend an all-day training on October 25th and be given ongoing training. The role of the peer supporter, as has been mentioned, is to provide a form of emotional first aid, making available confidential one-on-one connection, encouragement, and caring to any colleague who has experienced an impactful event or series of events that creates feelings of stress and adversity. When a referral is made to the confidential email box, a chaplain from the local coordinator team will contact a trained peer-to-peer supporter. The supporter will be given their colleague's name, contact information, and the reason for the referral. They, in turn, will follow up with a phone call or email inviting their MD colleague for coffee or a time to check in with them face-to-face. No written notes will be made of this interaction. The expectation is that this is a one-time contact, although the MDs are welcome to meet again if this is appropriate. The peer-to-peer supporter will close the loop by letting our local coordinating team know that the contact has made. At that point, the original referral email will then be deleted. This program will go live Monday, October 28th. So my final slide, author unknown, seems to speak to a universal truth for many of us. Sometimes we need someone to simply be there, not to fix anything or to do anything in particular, but just to let us feel that we are cared for and supported. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Deville.
Good morning. It's great to be home. I have a lot of friends I know in the audience, and for those of you who don't know me, my name's Chuck Deville, and I was privileged to come to this institution in 1991 when I joined the thoracic clinic, and was blessed to have unbelievably supportive partners my whole career, as physicians, as nurses. This entire culture in this place is really remarkable. So I had peer-to-peer support all the way through, and without it, I think my life would have been quite different, frankly. In 2008, I had a patient transferred here from Adventist who was found down, profoundly hypertensive, was intubated in the field and got here, transferred by a surgeon at another institution with a diagnosis of aortic dissection made on a wet read on a CT. So couldn't really talk to anybody. The CT had a funny shadow. Back then it was still a disc that if you were lucky you get at work in the computer. We controlled his blood pressure, took him to surgery. Couldn't see the dissection. Sometimes you can't. On echo, the aorta looked okay. Ultimately, I put him on bypass, opened the aorta. He didn't have a dissection. Anyway, it went fine. He awoke, not quite normal. Neurologically, he was walking in the hall, didn't seem right. Had a great relationship with the family, everything was fine. I thought he gradually got better. 6 months later, I found myself embroiled in a lawsuit, and a real one that went all the way through a courtroom trial. I was fortunate that the trial was in July, and I had several retired teachers on the jury who could listen in a discerning way to the story and what happened and the evidence, and experts on both sides. And a week of listening to people say a lot of bad stuff about you, actually. Fortunately, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict in our favor, and that part was fine, but I was so not okay. So I actually had to leave for a couple of weeks and just get away before I could come back and see a patient again. And without my multiple friends and supporters who looked out for me the entire time I practiced, things could be really different. So I cannot speak more highly about what's happening here and what this is about, what it can mean. my story's trivial compared to the other two, but nevertheless, when I needed help, it was here, and I'm thankful for that.
Thank you for that. So we thank you for your attention here today. We wanted to introduce the concept of peer support. Why do we need it? What are we going to do here at Providence? And we are honored to share the next steps of the journey with you. What I wanted to do is just take a few moments to see if anybody had any thoughts or questions about what's going to happen next with the program, and any thoughts about barriers to physicians, providers accessing this here at Providence. Oh, that is hard to face a room of silence. Yes, hi. That is a great question. The question is the peer support program open to nurse practitioners as well as MDs? And I believe the initial training, if we get a referral for a nurse practitioner, we are going to do our best to get you support. Yeah. Was there another hand in the back? Yes.
Thank you for that great presentation. I'm wondering if you're in clinic, in your experience, I suspect that there was some low traction initially, and that expand. And what's the culture now? People feel like empowered, and is that what organization?
Great question, Dr. Pena. The question is the culture at the Oregon Clinic and ramping up utilization in our program, and what is our culture like now? And I will say, actually, we got an outreach request even before we'd gone live with the program. So right off the start, there was interest and opportunity. The fact that now we are getting direct requests from physicians themselves in need of support is phenomenal, and I will say our trusted and respected peer supporters are doing a phenomenal job also supporting one another. We trained leadership at the Oregon Clinic, mindful of the fact that there's the potential for a power differential between an employed physician and a shareholder or a managing partner and a physician, not with the intention of creating a peer support power differential, but rather to create space for leaders to support leaders as well. And we know in our leadership development that you have peers who do informally emotional first aid all the time, but there is something really special about the no fixing rule of peer support. Did that answer your question? Okay. Yes, sir.
I congratulate you for what I heard today. By the time the peer recognizes that there's trouble in their colleague, it could be a tip of the iceberg. And the way back goes far beyond a one-and-done intervention. So my question is about referral.
Yeah.
I have a very personal experience with what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It cost me my prior career. So I'd like to know, have you gathered resources to say what's next?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes, we have. So what we did at the Oregon Clinic is we developed with the permission of Joe Shapiro and Brigham and Women's handouts about coping after an adverse event, coping after a medical error, and then within the Oregon Clinic, we've crafted one-page PDFs about the available resources that we have, including but not limited to telepsych, free confidential therapy through the Medical Society of Metropolitan Portland, our employee assistance program. At Providence, there are a number of resources for employed physicians that are on a special website that we are also looking to raise awareness among affiliated practitioners who maybe aren't with a larger organization about what the resources are to help providers not feel isolated. And at the Oregon Clinic, this is just the first baby step toward what does our wellness culture look like. And with our sort of unique organizational structure, everything's funded by the physicians. So my thought was, if we can get buy-in and engagement for a peer support program, we can then create the financial case for allocating resources toward more formal collegiality developments, like the impact program that Stanford has done, or Permanente mentoring programs. Oregon Anesthesia Group is doing an excellent formal mentoring program. If you see an anesthesiologist, ask them about it. Not in any way to minimize the impact of what you've experienced personally, but yes, we've definitely made an effort. Did that answer your concern? Any other? Yes.
What you laid out were pretty dramatic examples of the way people are affected by patient care. And yet, over 54 or 55% of primary care is burnt out. And it's sort of the daily obligations, the daily work, death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Yeah.
Where are we going with that? What are we looking at?
And Tricia's standing up, which I'm thinking means she may have a thought on this also.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so as I think about this a lot, clearly we need major organizational change in the way that we're providing medicine. That's going to take time. And I think that, from my vantage point, I'm very motivated and passionate about that change, and how we make the financial case for really investing in a different way. I think the momentum is headed there, but it's not going to get there fast. But I want to say that, yes, that's important. That work is happening. And we need to figure out how to support people right now that are suffering. And so in my mind, we're doing both things at once. How do we support our providers right now? And how are we advocating for organizational change? I think they both need to happen simultaneously.
It's a great point, and we have the literature that shows the return on investment for every dollar you spend on more collegiality interventions. We just got back from the American Conference on Physician Health, the second annual one that they hold every other year, and saw unpublished research and programs from actually not just in the United States, but in Canada, that have shown an impact with skill building. And it's not just be more resilient and work harder for less. It's shared knowledge and that sense of, yes, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts, but you're not alone, and here's how we can show up differently and support one another, and sometimes come up with some workable solutions. I think we found with the Compassion team that the workshops in their clinics where they actually had protected time and did some specific skill building, not only did they increase production, but they improved satisfaction scores across all team members. So it's exciting that there are interventions out there. We can't move fast enough. We hear your pain. What else? Yeah.
Question for you about how you match up a peer supporter with somebody who's not able for self-employers. Because one peer supporter may be an excellent choice depending on the issue. If it's a clinical issue, maybe I would want to talk to somebody in my own field.
Yeah.
If it's sort of a personal issue, I might want to talk to somebody who's also dealing with a sick elder parent.
Great.
And is there any consideration given to what the provider wants or needs? Like, I want to talk to somebody who I'll never see again because
Yeah.
I'm so embarrassed by this. Or,
Great question. So the question is, at the Oregon Clinic, how are we matching up peer supporters? And does it matter what the peer being offered support potentially needs? And what we've done at the Oregon Clinic essentially is match up interventionalists with interventionalists. I'm the coordinator of that. So that just basically means I learn about the request. I know who that provider is. And what I do is send out a BCC email to all of my trained providers who are either like critical care, internists or surgeons, and say, I have a need for peer support because of, if I know what it is, it's just in very general terms, like an adverse event or a patient death, or has anybody been in a lawsuit before, as one hypothetical example. And then basically the first person that responds back, if it seems like that's a good fit, I'll make contact with them and say, this is the person who needs the support, and this is what I know, and they'll tell me, are they comfortable reaching out, yes or no? And all I want to know back is, did they make contact? Was the outreach call accepted? And would the peer supporter like a debrief call? And I leave it to that person to then make contact with the person in need. And if it turns out that they need additional resources or something else that's not being offered in that peer support intervention, we have our resource lists kind of for additional. And what it is turning into, I didn't want to burden anybody with, I mean, everybody is volunteering their time. The great thing about the way Providence is approaching this is we actually have CME attached to that formal training by the compassion team. It's kind of a thoughtful reward for your time and service. So with the peer supporters making the outreach calls, I didn't want anybody to have to make more than 4 outreach calls in any given year. And the intention was, it's a one-time cup of coffee or a phone call, and our lived experience is providers are taking time out, they're meeting for coffee, they've spent a couple of hours with a peer, they've, on their own taken the initiative to check in, in another week. It's not therapy, but it just feels therapeutic to create those connections.
I would also say that for either self-referrals or if you're referring a colleague and know a little bit of the context about what happened, that would be helpful to include. Our chaplain team's going to do their best to kind of connect people with clearly the lawsuit is a stressor here, or a procedural complication, or personal issues that they're going to do their best to make the best connection possible. So if you felt comfortable providing just some basic information in that email, that would be helpful. Yeah.
So Trish, you put up there the slide on moral injury.
Yeah.
Which is so critical in this whole business, because we've got the focus on the individual, but the moral injury is more of a kind of an overreaching problem that is systemic, not only in Providence, but healthcare in this country. And so, because my coach friend sent me a 5-minute video on what is moral injury. Oh my gosh, that's what's the problem. And it's not the individual, it's the system. So I know you're trying to make systemic change. It comes slow.
Yeah, it's slower than it should be, slower than any of us want it to be. I think, in my opinion, one of the biggest untapped resources is physicians advocating for change. And I think the more that we can all get on the same page and really work to change our own culture around reaching out for help and, providing space for that empathic care and acknowledging a moral injury, then I think that's going to be the biggest catalyst to change, is actually us acknowledging that, coming together, being a voice and advocating, because I think that it needs to happen.
We've got time for 2 more questions.
I just have a statement. So I've only been here for 3 years, and I remember sitting in this very room and learning about this issue, and it shocked me about how many physicians were, dying by suicide. And so that's, within 3 years, I just want to say, wow, this is amazing, and I want to congratulate the team for coming together. And I mean, now we have something to at least acknowledge that and engage with it. So, good job.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
One of the things I think we're missing in our whole society is resilience. And it has to be taught when we're young. And if we don't have enough resilience, it's harder to deal with problematic situations when you get older. And you're coming along at an older age where people may have not had enough experiences that give them resilience as a youngster. But we're trying to build resistance now. But there's an anti-resilience program called the Lawyer. And what effect does a lawyer have on this? That's my first question. And the second point I would make, they had a program similar to this 30 years ago over at Good Sam. It seemed to be very successful.
Yeah.
Private, very private.
Yeah. So the lawyers, technically peer support is discoverable, and the lived experience, and Shapiro is the kind of international thought leader on this. She is actually up in Canada now with their annual meeting training peer supporters. She has not learned of any case where, a peer supporter was, subpoenaed and deposed. And the legal opinion in Oregon is that it only makes the defendant look better. And from a peer supporter standpoint, this is why we don't take notes. This is why we don't keep any data. My spreadsheet is basically a notebook with the date, the medical degree, adverse event, outreach call made, outreach call accepted. Those are my stats. So we don't want any documentation. And God forbid, if you were a peer supporter in a case, for a peer that ended up in litigation, and somebody asked, did you talk to someone? It's like, well, number one, do you even remember what was said? And number two, emotional first aid from a peer, what a wonderful thing. What a compassionate human being you are, not this sort of aloof, distant provider. And I can't speak to the legacy experience 30 years ago. I know there was literature published in 2007 when Legacy Medical Group had just started forming, showing that they had some interventions that helped reduce burnout, but somehow there was a shift. And we've had more suicides in the 11 years, and what's different? Sorry, go ahead.
Another thing that this is complementary to is the malpractice program they have at the Oregon Medical Association.
Yes.
And I think would work in concert with what they're trying to accomplish and what you're trying to accomplish.
Correct. The Oregon Wellness Program and also the Medical Society of Metropolitan Portland, which has now been contracted to provide services with the Oregon Wellness Program. The idea is, and the impetus for this came out of Lane County, and I know we're kind of out of time and need to wrap up, but there are providers in very isolated counties where bad things are happening and providers are killing themselves, and we need to have better support, and that was the impetus for this. So the way this is springing up, it's almost like mushrooms. Like there are pockets of innovation, and yes, there is potentially a duplication of resources. Until we can unify, we're doing the best we can, kind of one facility at a time.
So thank you all for being here. I just wanted to say that the success of this program is really dependent on our medical staff, and a big thank you to our guest speakers for being willing to share their vulnerable stories today. They were very powerful.